LinkTV, connecting you to the world. LinkTV is viewer-supported. Watch more at linktv.org.
Why do our politicians not plan for the future? Why don't journalists look ahead?
Veteran correspondent Robert Fisk has spent over 30 years covering the biggest conflicts in the Middle East, showing us the human face of collateral damage.
If you saw what I see on battlefields, you would never ever support a war or talk about just wars.
Now, for a new administration, Fisk is telling the hard truths.
We must withdraw our military forces because it is not our land.
Robert Fisk, The Age of the Warrior.
I want to begin by reading an article which I wrote, 2006, actually before I was last here. It's titled The Age of the Warrior, which is the title of the book. In the week that George Bush took to fantasizing that his blood-soaked war on terror would lead the 21st century into a shining age of human liberty. Remember that? I went through my mailbag to find a frightening letter addressed to me by an American veteran whose son is serving as a lieutenant colonel and medical doctor with US forces in Baghdad. He's just come home safely, by the way. Put simply, my American friend believes that the change of military creed under the Bush administration, from that of soldier to that of warrior, is encouraging American troops to commit atrocities. From Abu Ghraib to Guantanamo to Bagram to the battlefields of Iraq and to the black prisons of the CIA, humiliation and beatings, rape and anal rape and murder have now become so commonplace that each new outrage is creeping into the inside pages of our newspapers. My reporting notebooks are full of Afghan and Iraqi complaints of torture and beatings from August 2002 and then from 2003 to the present. How, I keep asking myself, did this happen? Obviously, the trail leads to the top. But where did this cult of cruelty begin? So first, here's the official US Army Soldier's Creed, originally drawn up to prevent any more Vietnam atrocities. In fact, it was written after My Lai. And after this, every US serviceman, wherever he was in the world, carried this document. I am an American soldier. I am a member of the United States Army, a protector of the greatest nation on earth. Because I'm proud of the uniform I wear, I will always act in ways creditable to the military service and the nation that it is sworn to guard. No matter what situation I am in, I will never do anything for pleasure, profit, or personal safety which will disgrace my uniform, my unit, or my country. I will use every means I have, even beyond the line of duty, to restrain my army comrades from actions disgraceful to themselves and the uniform. I am proud of my country and its flag. I will try to make the people of this nation proud of the service I represent, for I am an American soldier. I think that's pretty eloquent. I've got nothing against that. And here's the new version, however, of what is now called the warrior ethos, introduced by Donald Rumsfeld, which American servicemen now carry with them. I am an American soldier. I am a warrior and a member of a team. I serve the people of the United States and I live the Army values. I will always place the mission first. I will never accept defeat. I will never quit. I will never leave a fallen comrade. I am disciplined, physically and mentally tough, trained and proficient in my warrior tasks and drills. I always maintain my arms, my equipment on myself. I am an expert and I am a professional. I stand ready to deploy, engage, and destroy the enemies of the United States of America in close combat. I am a guardian of freedom and the American way of life. I am an American soldier. Like most Europeans and an awful lot of you, I was quite unaware of this new and ferocious code for US armed forces, although it's not hard to see how it fits in with Bush's rantings. I'm tempted to point this out in detail, but my American Vietnam veteran did so with such eloquence in his letter to me that the response should come in his words. The warrior creed, he wrote, allows no end to any conflict except total destruction of the enemy. It allows no defeat and does not allow one ever to stop fighting, lending itself to the idea of the long war. It says nothing about following orders. It says nothing about obeying laws or showing restraint. It says nothing about dishonorable actions. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that that warrior ethos, that document, paves the road to Bagram and Kandahar prison and to Guantanamo and the black underground prisons, which we know are also existing in Europe. That is the road to torture. In this way, I believe that your armed forces have been demeaned. And it came from the top. This came from the Pentagon. This was not just a few bad apples. The strange thing, you know, about the whole Abu Ghraib scandal was that when the pictures first came out, and God bless Seymour Hersh, one of the few great American journalists, for exposing even the pictures as well as the text. When those pictures first came out, the Pentagon tried to put considerable pressure on the American media not to disseminate the pictures in a very wide way. And the purpose of this appeal was that if many people saw these pictures, Iraqis might come to hate American troops in Iraq. And I was in Baghdad when those pictures were published, and the warning was quite unnecessary. The Iraqis had no reaction at all because they knew torture was going on in Iraq. They were tortured themselves. They had been telling my colleague Patrick Coben and I about torture for years. We have been printing reports of this torture. I have, even within 2 to 3 months of the invasion being completed in 2003, I was writing reports in my newspaper, The Independent, of people being beaten in captivity. One man told me how he was beaten with a filled plastic water bottle, and when the bottle broke, they went on beating with the sharp edges of the plastic on his body. Very mild compared to Abu Ghraib. We were printing this, but of course we had no photographs, and we had the Americans denying that any kind of abuse ever took place. So it was there. The Iraqis knew this was going on. They assumed that we would torture them, and we did. It was we who were surprised by the torture at Abu Ghraib. It was we, the Westerners, in our precious society, that were shocked to find what we did. And you see, I think that in many ways, we journalists are responsible for your ignorance. I don't think you're ignorant people. I think Americans are very smart people, by the way. You know, people keep saying, oh, many people in America have so little information. But when I take a train, like I did not long ago, from an Amtrak train from Washington to Georgia, I couldn't sleep at night. I talked to the train crew. They knew all about the Middle East. They understood the situation of the Palestinians under occupation and so on. It is somewhere between the people and the administration that there is a gap. You know, I don't use the internet, which I loathe, and I don't use email, so I get real mail. Do you remember those envelopes with stamps on? About 250 to 300 a week. And sometimes more than half of them are coming from the United States. But the letters from America and the letters from Britain have one common theme. And they're coming from ordinary people, sometimes from people in the military, British as well as American, but mostly just from civilians, sometimes middle-aged people, pensioners. And they're all saying there's a problem we have. We elect our member of parliament, or you elect your congressman or congresswoman. But when they go to the Hill, or when our MPs go to the British Parliament, they no longer represent us. We vote for them, but the moment they've got the vote, the elector and the elected break apart. The person who is elected no longer represents the people who elected them. And this break in governance is a major problem at the moment. Over and over again, I get letters from readers, particularly in Britain in this case, what can we do? So, you know, a woman says to me, I told my MP what I think about Iraq, and he goes to Parliament and supports the government. And I don't know what you do about that. But it is a major problem, and I see it coming from readers of my newspaper and from you in this country too. I don't know how you do it, and it's not my job. I'm not an activist, I'm a journalist, but I see the problem out there. You know, where do our leaders get their instructions from? There's a very interesting case in Mr. Blair, our own dear Mr. Blair, who now has become a Catholic. He runs a faith foundation. He's the peace envoy. He was the war envoy, and now he's the peace envoy in the Middle East. But he hasn't been to Gaza, presumably because Hamas don't wear ties. And there was a very good article, I hate to say this, in the Sunday Times not long ago, because it's owned by Murdoch. I restrain myself, but nonetheless it was in the Sunday Times, in which a very fine writer said, you know, Blair has found God, but he doesn't seem to take any advice. Like, God didn't say to him in, say, February 2003, Tony, this Iraq thing may not be such a good idea. I suppose Tony speaks to God. Maybe your president does. I don't know. I mean, I've been asking people in New Zealand, Armenia, Ireland, Britain, France, can anyone tell me why Blair says and does what he does? I have no idea. I think it might be because after his genuine political victory in Northern Ireland, ending Britain's 800-year colonial war of suffering and brutality between the British, the English and the Irish, maybe it went to his head. Maybe he thought he could solve, the Kashmir crisis, the partition of India from 48, the Middle East. Or maybe it's just that British prime ministers, when they go up to bed, they go up past all these oil paintings on the staircase of Gladstone, Disraeli, Lloyd George, Winston Churchill, of course, and suddenly they find that Winston Churchill's waistcoat fits rather well. Over and over again, and journalists forget this, we constantly, when we want to go to war, we evoke World War II. Always. At the time of the Suez Crisis in 1956, Anthony Eden, British Prime Minister, called Nasser the Mussolini of the Nile. And of course, when we wanted to go to war in Iraq, well, not us, but they wanted to go to war in Iraq, Saddam became the Hitler of the Tigris River, the Hitler of Baghdad. And we were all entitled to become Winston Churchill. And anyone who objected to the war, they were an appeaser, like Neville Chamberlain. You know the story, the way it goes. And therefore, of course, we can then justify war. Not as the reality of war actually is, which is the total failure of the human spirit. It's about death, not about primarily victory or defeat, but as a policy option. You see, that's how we get the permission. The Archbishop of Canterbury, poor soul, actually said that the 1991 Gulf War was a just war. And if you saw what I see on battlefields in the Middle East, at massacres, bodies torn apart. The famous highway of death, there were actually two highways of death, north of Kuwait in 1991, where the British as well as the American Air Force had bombed and bombed and bombed, not just the military, but refugee cars as well. And there in the desert were men, some of them soldiers, some not, women and children, being torn apart, dead, by dogs. It was lunchtime. And bits of them, arms, fingers, being taken off to be eaten in the desert. You don't see that. If you saw what I see on battlefields, you would never, ever support a war or talk about just wars. But I've been over and over again confronted, particularly in British Commonwealth countries, by the argument, but don't you think World War II was just? And since my father, who was much older than my mum, fought in the First World War and has signed up to be the resistance leader in southern England after the German invasion, which of course mercifully never came because he would have been executed as a terrorist, no doubt. I think, yes, my father was right to be prepared to fight for England. Yes, the Royal Air Force was right to fight the Battle of Britain. But the World War II is finished. When Menachem Begin was sending the Israeli army up to Beirut in 1982, he wrote this crazed letter to President Ronald Reagan saying he felt as if he was advancing on Berlin with Hitler in his bunker, Hitler being the pathetic and corrupt Arafat. And, there was a very good piece written by Uri Avneri, a very brave Israeli journalist whom most of you will know of. He wrote an open letter to Menachem Begin, who of course then was the Israeli Prime Minister, and it began, "Dear Mr. Prime Minister, Hitler is dead." And I feel more and more we need to have a cut-off line after World War II. After the Second World War, we introduced legislation and human rights codes and regulations to prevent World War III. We had new protocols of the International Red Cross, part of which was founded on the Hague Convention, which was before the First World War. We had the UN, the General Assembly, the Security Council. The European Union was founded as a coal and trade organization between Germany and France to prevent another battle of the Verdun, World War I, and to prevent another occupation of Paris by the German army. Germany and France would never go to war again, nor would Europe. We'd better forget Bosnia at the moment. But we laid down a forest of laws to protect human rights, to protect us. And they were good laws. And we were right to do what we did. I believe in the UN, despite the fact that it's a friendly old donkey that comes clip-clopping in at the end when we need it. But it's there to be used. And I don't think after World War II, I think it's very hard to find a just war or an excuse for a just war. Korea? At times, at the beginning perhaps. But was Vietnam just? Was Yemen a just war? The British fought in Yemen, the British fight against AOKA in Cyprus, or Mau Mau in Kenya, or in Palestine. Look, was the partition of India a just thing? Was Northern Ireland just? Was the Iran-Iraq war just? 8 years, 1.5 million dead? I watched many of them die. I don't think just war exists anymore. I think, though, we need that cut-off point after World War II. And I think many Arabs whom I talk to say the same thing. They believe the same thing. You know, one of the strange things is that we have this idea that in some way the Arab-Muslim world don't know what we know, that they don't have the advantages, of course, of our civilization. I don't think we care about them very much. That's why we don't know how many have died in Iraq. We know exactly how many American servicemen have died. I think the figure today is 4,167. And we know where they come from, their ages, their names, precisely how many children they have, the age of their widow. But how many people in this room, there will be one or two, can put their hands up now and name, I don't ask you to name, just tell me, how many can name an Iraqi killed since 2003? There will be a few hands. Any? Not a lot, you see, because we don't care about the Iraqi dead. The only time that President Bush was asked how many Iraqis were killed, he gave a hopeless underestimate. He said 30,000, but what he actually said was 30,000 more or less. Well, more or less. Can you imagine if I'd been asked how many American troops had died in Iraq, and he said, 4,000 more or less? It would have been scandalous. But it's okay if it's about the Iraqis. We are going to give them democracy. We're going to give Iraq human rights. We've had a surge, which means escalation, by the way, if you're using Vietnam speak. So it's okay. The fact that the casualties have fallen because the Shiites have ethnically cleansed all the Sunnis out of the mixed areas doesn't matter. I mean, how many Iraqis have been killed? 250,000, 500,000, 1 million more? I have no idea. Perhaps, I don't know. And we will never know, and we're not meant to know. And we don't care. You know, there was a CIA officer came up to me with a huge pistol in his belt in the Spanish base near Kufa. This is after the Madrid bombings, but before the Spanish withdrew. And he said, there are dozens of armed men on the streets at night, in the country roads. I said, of course, it's an insurgency. He said, what could we have done to stop this? And I said, well, when you reached Baghdad, you might have pitched a huge tent city for every sick and wounded Iraqi outside Baghdad, and give them your help and help the suffering Iraqis and show your love for them. But you didn't do that. I said you could have adopted a Roman measure. I don't mean the crucifixions. I said every time the Romans occupied a country, they made all the people in that country citizens of Rome. And I said, not entirely in humour, why didn't you make every Iraqi a citizen of the United States, if you love them so much? They would have been very proud. They wouldn't have all rushed to JFK and asked for, a green card. They'd have been proud to be citizens of America. There would have been no insurgency. They will be your people. And it will be your oil. And they would be very grateful to you. But that did not commend itself to us, did it? Because that wasn't what it was about. I've said this before, I've said it in California before. I think the Arabs would like some of our democracy. After all, they've tolerated all these dictators whom we support, and all the torture chambers which we accept, and all the police torturers, many of whom have been trained by us. They would like some of our democracy, and I think they'd like some packages of human rights from our supermarket shelves. But the freedom that I am always asked about in Lebanon, where I live, is that the Arabs would like freedom from us. And this we do not intend to give them. Was Iraq about oil? Well, if the Iraqi national product had been asparagus or carrots, the 82nd Airborne would not be in Mosul or Baghdad. Of course it wouldn't. But there's another point. I calculated for our Sunday magazine a couple of years ago that we now have, when I say we, I'm talking about the West, we now have, per head of population, 22 times as many military personnel in the Muslim world than did the Crusaders in the 12th century. It was a baker, of all people in Baghdad, who asked me a question. Mr. Robert, this polite way of talking to someone. Mr. Robert, I have a question. Fisk brings out his notebook. Yes? He said, why are you, and by you he means you, the Western military, why are you in Kazakhstan and Tajikistan? He's right, there's a French squadron in Dushanbe, which acts as close air support for the British in Helmand province in Afghanistan. Why, he said, do you go into Pakistan? Why are you in Afghanistan? Why are you in Iraq? Why are our military forces in Turkey and in Jordan and in Egypt and in Algeria? US Special Forces are in a base outside Taman Rasset in the southern Sahara. Why are you in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia? Why are you in Qatar? Why are you, big American air base? Why are you in Oman? Why are you in Yemen? And I couldn't give him an answer because I hadn't really thought of it like that. It's an iron curtain we've built with our fortresses. And in fact, it starts way up in Greenland, US forces, and Iceland, and the United Kingdom, of course, and Germany, where the British maintain bases as well as the Americans. And then in Bosnia, we now have Camp Bondsteel. And then in Greece, where it joins up with Turkey, we now have an iron curtain stretching from the ice cap almost to the equator. Stronger and bigger than the Iron Curtain of which Winston Churchill spoke originally in this country, which stretched from the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. What is it for? What's on the other side of this Iron Curtain? Russia? China? India? Is that why it's there? I ask you this question because here was an ordinary, not very well-educated Iraqi on the streets of Baghdad asking a very important question that I hadn't thought of, and probably many of you haven't thought of, and none of our journalists have mentioned. Because we like to follow the narrative that's laid down by our presidents and our prime ministers and our generals, and by Tom Friedman. This is the problem. You know, part of my obsession with words, and I've said this before, and some of you will have heard me say this before, is the way in which we desemanticize conflict. How, because of our fear of offending Arab or Israeli, in many cases, of course, Israelis, we change the words we use. Take the wall, the Israeli wall, built for the most part on Arab land, illegally, against the law. And we refer to it as a security barrier, which was the East German expression for the Berlin Wall, Sicherheit. Or we refer to it as a fence. And, of course, colonies of Israelis, and Israelis only on Arab land, have become settlements and now very often neighborhoods in the New York Times. You see, there's a problem. Ever since Colin Powell, when he was Secretary of State, instructed US diplomats in the Middle East to refer to the occupied territories as the disputed territories, many journalists, especially in this country, and agency reporters, AP, UPI, Reuters, have followed suit and written the same. And you see the problem. I'm against all violence for any reason ever, but if a child throws a stone and you know that his land is occupied, there's a wall going through his father's or his family's property, or that colonies are being built on Palestinian land, you can understand the context in which he does that. But if it's about a dispute, something you can solve over a cup of tea or in a law court, or a fence, something that might be at the bottom of your garden, then obviously Palestinians are generically violent to resist this. And thus, by our cowardice as journalists, we demean a whole group of people. You know, I'm kind of tired of hearing, particularly in this country, but I get it in Britain, people who say, you know, you journalists can be very biased. You should be neutral. You should give equal 50% of each report should be to two sides in a dispute. Ha, ha, ha. You know, that's okay if you're reporting a football match. Manchester United versus Newcastle. Or if you're reporting on a new highway that's going to be a public inquiry as to whether it's going to cut through a forest or not. But the Middle East is not a football match. It is a tragedy of great bloodshed and suffering and betrayal. And I believe that journalists should be neutral and unbiased on the side of those who suffer. For example, if you were reporting the slave trade in the 18th century, would you give equal space in your report to the slave ship captain? No, you would talk to the slaves. If you were reporting the liberation of a Nazi extermination camp, would you give equal time to the SS spokesman? No, you'd talk about the victims and the survivors. When I was in Jerusalem in August of 2001, tick, 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 the clock was ticking, wasn't it? A Palestinian suicide bomber, and their executioners are suicide bombers because they see who they're going to murder, walked into a pizzeria and blew himself up and killed 16 Israelis, more than half of them children. I was eating my lunch down the road, rushed up to the scene. I saw a woman with a chair leg through her, an Israeli woman, and an Israeli child with no eyes. Did I give equal space in my report to the spokesman of Islamic Jihad? No, I did not. And when I was in the Sabra camps on September 18th, 1982, physically climbing over the corpses, when 1,700 Palestinians had been massacred, civilians, did I give equal time to the spokesman for the Israeli army who sent the murderers, the Lebanese Christian Phalange, into the camp? No, I did not. There are ethical, moral issues in the Middle East, as there are all around the world. And we journalists should be able to have a moral feeling about what this means and what it is. Not just report as if we are machines on a mathematical formula. 50%. We've now given 600 words to the Palestinians. We need to give 601 or 599 to the Israelis, or the Syrians and the Lebanese, or the Iranians and the Iraqis, or whatever. That is not what journalism should be about. I don't believe so. You know, I'm very struck by the way in which, over and over again, American newspaper editors, this happens elsewhere, but particularly here, bemoan the falling circulation of their papers. And when I come here and I read your newspapers, I'm not surprised it's falling. And it's not just because of the pap that they publish about the major crises of bloodshed in the world. I mean, I find the New York Times on the Middle East incomprehensible. I mean, heaven knows what people who don't know the Middle East think about it. But it's not just that, it's not even well written. There's not even a literary style in it. It's like they don't care about words. I bring this up with you for a very specific reason. I'm going to quote now from a letter written home by a US Marine major from Ramadi. He's writing to his dad. This is a real letter, and I have reams of them here sent to me by one of his friends. He's trying to get the Iraqis to join in with local government, to make the Iraqis participate in the local administration of Ramadi. I don't agree with everything he says, but this man speaks with an eloquence worthy of Joseph Conrad. This is an American soldier, American Marine. Sorry, they're not soldiers, they're Marines. We are trying to empower the Iraqis to walk instead of the Marines beside us, but the graft has not yet taken. There is something culturally childish in their understanding of basic Western governance and management that will require immeasurable education and probably several generations to overcome if they find it of any interest. That education is, of course, a choice that they have to make on their own. They are not our people. Our understanding of their tribal governance and its relationship to formal civic management is equally naive, and it charges our frustration. The problem now is that their every inconvenience has become our responsibility. They act as if they cannot comprehend our sacrifices and are thus ungrateful for them. The reality is that they cannot culturally comprehend our altruism or believe our stated intentions. Even though it is not their desire to offend, we are insulted, and it bleeds us of affection and tolerance. Liberation will compete with invasion as our legacy, but locally we are ideologically irrelevant. Our presence is mostly only of interest to those who seek to benefit from our contracts and donations. It is a region of people making alliances, business deals, friendships and enemies one day at a time, without a real concept of sustainable services, resources or trust. No future, just daily survival as they know it, family and tribe. Our contributions may be counted long after we have withdrawn, but they will not recount the names of our fallen, so many now. Each wound will be absorbed into the quiet sadness that we allow to pass beneath us as a people and a country. Our loss will have never even occurred to most people here. This guy also has a sense of humor. And again, remember, I'll ask you, when did you ever read anything like this in an American newspaper? A US Marine writes better than journalists. You know, when I was covering the 1991 Gulf War, I arrived in Saudi Arabia to find all these journalists arriving from all places like Denver. Many of them never been abroad before. All of them, though, seemed to like to wear military costume. There was actually a journalist turned up from a local TV station in the States, and he had camouflaged shoes. He had leaves painted on them. And those of you who've seen photographs of deserts or even been there will notice there aren't an awful lot of trees in the desert of Saudi Arabia. The funny thing was that many of the soldiers I met, US and British, wanted to write. All the journalists wanted to be soldiers, all the soldiers wanted to be journalists. It might have been a good switch. But here is the same soldier, and here I dare you not to laugh, writing about the local government in Ramadi and how they tried to set up the government. Remember, he's writing to his dad here in the States. So what news about the new government, you may ask? Well, the provisional military governor was replaced by the transitional governor, who resigned under threat and was replaced with another transitional governor. He was then replaced by the emergency appointed governor, who has just been replaced by the selected governor chosen by the elected provincial council. He never made a speech or publicised his views, never debated the other candidates, and was not present during the selection, never making an acceptance speech. He was promptly kidnapped by a rival tribe, while his tribe fought another tribe on the Syrian border. The recently displaced emergency appointed governor returned in hopes of regaining the position. However, the deputy governor is now serving as the acting governor, while the actual selected governor is in captivity. But there was an election, so democracy is in full bloom, I am to understand. This guy can write, can't he? We are now trying to force the power of decision onto the elected provincial council and the city officials. It is a difficult thing to keep myself inactive in matters of governance here. The instinct to impose order and command the requisite discipline in the Iraqi leadership must be quelled in order to allow sovereign stewardship to develop at its native pace and in a native form. I fight myself to remain insignificant in the process. I haven't the nature for passive observation. I share the American fascination with action, and it has consistently betrayed us in our foreign policy. Our continued involvement will continue the state of dependency, and our eventual departure will leave nothing but cosmetic structure here. Iraq will return to what it is. Our common sense is not common to this people, and that understanding must be given proper respect. I do my best, but I twitch with an urge for the folly of intrusion. Isn't that brilliant? Yeah, he deserves your applause. But we journalists don't write like that. When have you ever read anything like this in the LA Times, or the San Francisco Chronicle, or the Orange County Register? This is the problem. This is the problem. But there are many others. Look, here is one of the many clippings I've been getting ready for the companion volume to my last book. Here's a report. The date of this would be March 22nd, 2006. It's a report from the New York Times on how the Israeli police stopped a vehicle carrying a bomb with 10 Palestinians inside. And apparently they had intelligence that this vehicle was being driven to Jerusalem. After a highway chase, Israeli police seized 10 Palestinians and a bomb, is the headline. But when you come to paragraph 16, you find this. No suspects were seized, but a 10-year-old Palestinian girl in a taxi was killed when Israeli soldiers fired on the vehicle. Now, journalism school teaches you that the biggest part of the story should be in paragraph 1. The big story here is that a 13-year-old girl was killed, but it's in paragraph 16. Why? Because the journalist didn't spot the significance, or because it was the Israelis, not the Palestinians, who shot the little girl? Why do our politicians not plan for the future? Why don't journalists look ahead? Why don't we look a year in front, 2 years in front? One of the reasons, I fear, is that we reporters go with our notebooks and we have lots of clippings and we Google. This is my hatred of the internet coming through again. But we don't take history books with us to Bosnia or to Northern Ireland or to the Gulf or to Iraq. We don't remember that the British invaded Iraq in 1917, part of the First World War, in which my father, my dad, who was much older than my mother, was a soldier, Third Battle of the Somme. Part of the reason for the First World War was to destroy the Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe. And we occupied Baghdad in 1917, and General Angus Maud, British commander, made an announcement, which I've got a copy of at home, cost me $2,000 in an auction, but it's the original. We come here, he said of the British Army, 1917, we come here not as conquerors, but as liberators to free you from generations of tyranny. We're always going to free these people. And we always come, of course, with our Humvees and our swords and our horses and our helmets and our Apache helicopters and our M1A1 Abrams tanks. In 1920, an insurgency against the British occupation. What happened? We besieged Fallujah, we besieged Najaf. British intelligence told the War Department in London. When did the War Department become the Ministry of Defence all around the world? We told them that terrorists were crossing the border from Syria. This is 1920. Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, stood up in the House of Commons, 1920, and said, if British troops leave Iraq now, there will be chaos and civil war. Winston Churchill even organised a surge. And then we went over to using the British Air Force to bomb recalcitrant Iraqis, just like the Americans do the same now. I don't think we bombed quite as many wedding parties in Afghanistan, but nonetheless, we did the same. The same pattern, and we don't read history. Why didn't we plan for post-war Iraq? I know there were plans in the State Department. Rumsfeld basically tore them up, but why weren't there real plans? I think one of the reasons, well, there are two reasons. Firstly, because our politicians and statesmen today have no experience of war. Not one of them. Well, McCain does if he becomes the president, but that's the only one. When I grew up, Prime Ministers of Britain, Attlee, who was in the First World War, Eden, who was in the First World War, as well as Foreign Secretary in the Second, Churchill, who had been in the Battle of Omdurman and the trenches of the First World War. Even when I was correspondent in Northern Ireland for the Times, before Rupert Murdoch, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland was William Whitelaw, who was in the crossing of the Rhine in 1945. These people knew what it was like to see people who had been blown apart, including their friends. But today, do you think Tony Blair knows anything about war except what he sees on TV? Do you think Gordon Brown does? Well, we know that Mr. Bush felt it necessary to defend the skies of Texas from the Viet Cong. But the point is that there isn't any leader in the world today, in the West, plenty in the other part of the world, who have any experience of war. But there's another problem. And that is that television, 24-hour TV, constant press conferences impose new priorities on our leaderships. It's not, what are we going to do with Iraq after we capture it? It's, can we get Saddam's capture on prime time tonight at 6 p.m. or shall we announce it by 10 p.m.? Mr. Prime Minister, is the press conference at 4 o'clock now? How are we going to present what happened in Baghdad this morning? Everything is pinned to the next hour, the next 24 hours, how we'll present something. It's presentation. Hence we have a State Department official touring the Middle East, apparently under the illusion that there's nothing wrong with US policies, it's the presentation of them that just didn't get it right. I couldn't resist going to one of these meetings in Beirut with the Lebanese press, which eventually, after we'd listened to two former US diplomats, one of them speaking very good Arabic, explaining American policy and saying, you haven't quite understood it. Eventually, thank God, one of the Lebanese journalists stood up and said, "Sir, it's the policies that are a problem, not the bloody presentation of them." You see, and this is a problem, the idea that we don't challenge authority, which is what our job should be as foreign correspondents. And presidents and prime ministers don't expect to be challenged. They don't have to be if Judith Miller is writing about weapons of mass destruction in the New York Times. But the problem is this fawning on leadership by the press, which the leadership love, continues. The New York Times had all these allegations, courtesy of Ahmed Shalaby, about weapons of mass destruction. After the war, we had this long, tedious, boring article full of mea culpas. We won't do it again. We should have asked more details. And what do you get in the New York Times now? Syria has weapons of mass destruction. Iran has weapons of mass destruction. And so it goes on and on and on. The narrative written by the president or the prime minister and eagerly taken up by us as journalists. It wasn't always like this. Winston Churchill is not one of my heroes. My PhD at Trinity College Dublin was into Irish neutrality in the Second World War, and Churchill was a bully, constantly threatened to re-invade poor old Ireland. But Churchill had a prescience. In 1941, before Nazi Germany had invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa in August of that year, when the Wehrmacht, the German army, we British were still waiting for them to invade the coasts of Kent and go for London, Churchill set up a cabinet committee to organize the running of post-war occupied Nazi Germany 4 years before the end of the war. 4 years before the end of the war. 1 year later, Cambridge University started courses for British diplomats to run Germany after the war. We were right up there, in front. And now, the day the tanks crossed the Tigris River, in 2003, we hadn't the slightest idea what we were going to do with Iraq, except, of course, we'd rather like the oil. And that was it. I mean, I come back to Churchill again. I was researching Churchill and the Arab world for a lecture I gave in the Cabinet War Rooms in London. This is the deep underground bunkers from which Churchill ran the Second World War, bomb-proof in those days. And I found some remarkable prescience on the part of Churchill. For example, he wrote a series of articles for the Daily Express in 1936. Remember, we're talking here 36. We're talking 12 years before the Nakba, the disaster of the Palestinians, 12 years before Israel's War of Independence. But he was way up front talking about Islam. Now, when I went to the Middle East 32 years ago, all our enemies, and I use the word our meaning the West, and I'm giving Israel honorary membership of the West in this case, all our enemies were secular, socialist, leftist, usually with good relations with, East Berlin and the Kremlin. And they were called, the countries would be the Popular Democratic Republic of, which meant it wasn't popular, wasn't democratic, it wasn't a republic. And always our enemies were the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, etc., etc. But today, without exception, all our enemies are Islamist. They are Hamas or Hezbollah, or they are Islamic Jihad, or they are Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, or Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, or the Taliban. Yet we don't seem to have realized this extraordinary transition. We're fighting people who now fight on the basis of faith. Whether it's real faith, whether it's properly interpreted, is not the point. I suspect very strongly, and I feel it because I live in the Muslim world, that one of the reasons for the frustration and fury that I see and experience there is because Muslims did not lose their faith. Muslims still believe in God. And we largely do not. We in the West, there aren't many Christians left. Yes, I know you've got some fundamentalist ones in America, and we've got a few. Well, we've got Tony Blair. There are a few Christians around. But basically, we feel our society represents the results of the Renaissance, the Age of Enlightenment, the secularism, human rights, which we tried to bring about through international legislation after the Second World War. This is why our books never say Islam and Christendom. They always say Islam and the West, or Muslims and the West. This is our verbal way of explaining that there aren't many Christians left. And I think that for Muslims to know that they still believe in God, but people who largely do not believe in God can dominate their world, must be an extraordinarily painful experience. 22 times as many military personnel now than there were in the 12th century. I think this is something we do not think enough about. Tariq Aziz, standing next to James Baker when he was Secretary of State to George Bush Sr., said in Geneva just before the 1991 war, 18 million Iraqis cannot be defeated by a computer. But they were, and they were for a second time in 2003. I'm not sure what the answer to all that is, but I think this explains a lot of the Islamist enemies. I use Islamists in quotations and enemies in quotation marks that we now have. By the way, I do not believe in the clash of civilizations. I think that's bullshit. I do not believe in it. I live in the Muslim world. My landlord is a Druze. My driver is a Sunni Muslim. My classical Arabic translator is a Shiite. And my optician is a Christian. But I don't even think about it. And I don't say happy holiday to people. On December the 25th, my driver wishes me happy Christmas. And at the end of the Eid, I say Eid Mubarak to my landlord. I guess really in a way that we regard each other in the same way, and it's a great quotation from the Imam Ali, who of course is a Shiite divine, who said, if you see another man, and now we'd say a man and a woman, but these were patriarchal times, he said, if you see another man, he is either your brother in religion or your brother in humanity. And that is the only ethical idea with which I think we can look at the Middle East. And they will look at us in the same way. I do believe strongly that we must withdraw our military forces from the Middle East because it is not our land. We must have relations with Muslims. Social relations, political, religious, swamp the whole Middle East with our tourists. The people of the Middle East are very generous. In Iran, they love to see people, and they welcome people. Even in Iraq, when I go there still, people still say, welcome, welcome. How? I can't imagine, but they do. But militarily, we must get out. I was giving a talk in the north part of Dublin, Ireland, a few weeks ago, 3 months ago now. And I was sitting with Vincent Brown, a former colleague of mine when I was a reporter in Belfast. He's actually a Southern Catholic. And he said, but surely, Robert, surely, he said, just a minute, surely Islam is a threat to us. And I said, you mean the Egyptian army is in Dublin? You mean the Jordanian army is in Washington? Or is the Lebanese army in London, perhaps? You know? But we don't see it like that. It's the threat, the threat, the threat. And even when we offer Arabs democracy and they take us seriously, we forget to tell them who to vote for. And we gave the Palestinians democracy, and those pesky Palestinians voted for the wrong people. The Ottawa citizens said that they should be threatened with another election. So democracy is now a threat if you don't vote for the right people. I mean, I don't think the Palestinians voted for Hamas because they wanted an Islamic republic. They voted for Hamas because they were sick of the corruption of the Palestinian Authority. And I saw very clear evidence of this. One day I was in Jerusalem. I was in the Israeli part of Jerusalem. And I got a phone call on my mobile from a Palestinian official saying, an Israeli tank has just fired a shell through the home of one of our senior leaders of the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah. So, of course, Mr. Bob gets in his VW and futs down to the car. And there it is. There's the house. The Israeli tank is still there, and there's a bloody great hole in the side of the house. It did fire the shell. But what struck me, as I prowled, as I do dog-like through the house, was that amid all the rubble, I opened the bathroom door, and it all had gold-plated taps. And this is the Palestinian Authority representing a poverty-stricken people. You see, this is what voting is about. This is why it happens. Let's go back to Churchill again. Here's a man writing in 1936. He's on holiday. He's been on holiday to Morocco. This, of course, is French-run Morocco in those days. The French colonial power ran Morocco and Tunisia, and, of course, tragically, Algeria as well. And they had the French built railways, they built roads, telephones, modern hotels, and Churchill was enjoying himself. At the time, of course, Churchill, it was the wilderness years. He was out of power. He needed money, so he was writing. He became a journalist, just like he had been in the Boer War. The Arab inhabitants, he writes, are a perpetual attraction with their flowing, many-coloured robes. Every peasant is a picture, every crowd a pageant. He's in journalistic mode here. If winter sunshine is the quest, here is its achievement. Thus far all smiles. Is there a darker underside? The Arabs are a proud and ancient race, till only yesterday a race of conquerors. Are they tamed? Are they reconciled to this new civilization with its order, its efficiency, its many benefits, its proofs of active progress and its sense of effort? Can you hear the ghost of that US Marine Major talking? Or are they dreaming of the days of Arab greatness? The faith of Islam holds them all in a discipline of its own. From the balcony of my up-to-date hotel, I heard all night long the chants and drumbeats of the mosques. Who shall plumb the future? When I saw this article originally, I wrote in the bottom, ouch, exclamation mark. Here is a guy who was looking forward. We don't do that anymore. Even Churchill, and some of you, if you've read my previous book, will probably remember this. Churchill was able to write in an essay on the 23rd of July, 1937, his prophecy for what was going to happen to Palestine. 1937, remember, we're talking of 11 years before the Nakba, the Palestinian disaster, and Israel's War of Independence. He wrote how the wealthy, crowded, progressive Jewish state lies in the plains and on the seacoasts of Palestine. Around it in the hills and the uplands, stretching far and wide into the illimitable deserts, the warlike Arabs of Syria, of Transjordania, of Arabia, backed by the armed forces of Iraq, will offer the ceaseless menace of war. To maintain itself, the Jewish state will have to be armed to the teeth and must bring in every able-bodied man to strengthen its army. But how long will this process be allowed to continue by the great Arab populations in Iraq and Palestine? Can it be expected that the Arabs will stand by impassively and watch the building up, with Jewish capital and resources, of a Jewish army equipped with the most deadly weapons of war until it is strong enough not to be afraid of them? And if ever the Jewish army reaches that point, who can be sure that, cramped within their narrow limits, they will not plunge out into the new undeveloped lands that lie around them? Ouch. 30 years before the 1967 war. This is a guy who looked forward. Politicians don't do that, but nor do journalists. We do not look forward. We don't try to. You know, people say, how will the Americans get out of Iraq? Well, they'll find some way of representing it internationally. We've got to remember, by the way, that insurgents in Iraq and the Taliban in Afghanistan, just like the FLN in Algeria, who were fighting the French from 1954 to 1962, their primary aim is not to throw the occupiers out. They know they'll do that, and they will. Their primary aim is, by their resistance or insurgency or terrorism, call it what you like, is to ensure their role in the future government of their country after the occupiers have gone. The FLN fought the French in order to run Algeria when the French left, and they did run Algeria, and they still do. And that is why these insurgencies are taking place. We're only one step. We just think they're trying to want to get us out. They're already in front of us in thinking. They're thinking up front. They're way out there with their plan. They want to establish that they have a right to be in the ruling elite when we go. And that is what all these insurgencies are about. And that is why we will leave. But we have to find a way, do we not, of explaining to our own people why we're going. Somehow, whether it's McCain or Barack Obama, your administration is going to have to explain to you as a people why we got out, why all the wonderful hell disaster that we created is now going to be abandoned. And I think I know how it's going to be done. Originally, I found in little local papers, Denver, Cedar Rapids, Iowa. I remember the letters column of a local paper, reading it. Letters saying, why are we sacrificing our young men for people who don't appreciate us there? They're not worthy of our sacrifice, you see. But this is beginning to take much more serious form. Here is David Brooks, writing in the New York Times. He's been reading about the British occupation of Iraq in 1920. A bit late. Pity he didn't, read it before 2003, but there you go. The British tried to encourage responsible Iraqi self-government to no avail. But wait for it. He now goes on. Today, Iraq is much worse. The most perceptive reports talk of a complete collapse, of social disintegration. This latest descent was initiated by American blunders. He's got that bit right. But is exacerbated by the same old Iraqi demons, greed, bloodlust, and a mind-boggling unwillingness to compromise for the common good, even in the face of self-immolation. Iraq is teetering on the edge of futility, whatever that means. It will soon be time, effectively, to end Iraq. With a remaining fig leaf central government or not, it will be time to radically diffuse authority down to the only communities that are viable, the clan, tribal sect. Now, remarkably, of course, by coincidence, on the very same day, Ralph Peters, former military officer in the US, wrote this in USA Today. I'm not recommending that you read USA Today. It comes under my hotel door in America every time I come here. But here is Ralph Peters, who's also, by the way, was keen on the invasion, and he also has been reading about the British in Iraq. Late again. I was convinced that the Middle East was so politically, socially, morally, and intellectually stagnant that we had to risk intervention. There weren't enough literate people there, so we brought our tanks in. The country's prime minister has thrown in his lot with al-Sadr. Of course, he's a Shiite. He grew up partly in Iran. Only a military coup, which might come in the next few years, can hold this artificial country together. But we had a military coup by Saddam Hussein. He was our strongman until he invaded the wrong country, Kuwait, instead of the right country, Iran, which we were happy to encourage him to do in 1980. For all our errors, Peters goes on, we did give Iraqis a unique chance to build a rule of law democracy. They preferred to indulge in old hatreds, here we go again, confessional violence, ethnic bigotry, and a culture of corruption. Arab societies can't support democracy as we know it, and people get the government they deserve. But it's their tragedy, not ours. I'm editing this a bit, but these are the actual words. Iraq was the Arab world's last chance to board the train to modernity. They were going to get CNN. To give the region a future, not just a bitter past, but listen to this. He said the violence staining Baghdad streets with gore isn't only a symptom of the incompetence of the Iraqi government, but of the comprehensive inability of the Arab world to progress in any sphere of organized human endeavor. We are witnessing the collapse of a civilization. Thanks, Ralph. But it's going to be okay, because at the end of his article he says, Islamist terrorists have chosen Iraq as their battleground. I thought we did, actually, but there we go. And even after our departure, it will continue to consume them. But we'll still be the greatest power on earth, indispensable to other regional states, such as the Persian Gulf states and Saudi Arabia. Watch out, Saudi Arabia. That are terrified of Iran's growing might. If the Arab world and Iran embark on an orgy of bloodshed, the harsh truth is that we may be the beneficiaries, so that's okay then. And what we're doing, you see, is we are telling ourselves that these are Untermenschen. These people are barbarous. They don't want the civilization, these fruits of civilization that we offered them. They don't want it. Our sacrifices were not made in vain because we morally went in there to help them. But they are too primitive, so we're going to leave. And this, ladies and gentlemen, will be the grit that we shall scatter on the sand in order for our tank tracks to gain purchase in the desert and leave. This is how you will be told the situation comes about. I have to say that I find the situation in the Middle East and Southwest Asia utterly hopeless. Television reporters sometimes ring me up and say, can you see any light in the horizon, Bob, at the end of the tunnel? And I say none. And until you realize there is none, you cannot do anything that will create hope. Stop saying that the surge has worked. There's victory in Iraq. There's going to be victory in Afghanistan. Victory in Afghanistan? The Afghans defeated the Greeks, the Persians. They defeated the British in 1842 and wiped out an English army. They defeated us again at the end of the 19th century in the Victorian age, at the Battle of Maiwand. I've actually got, a very dear friend gave me the official British report on the disasters of the British Army fighting the Afghans in 1882. And at the Battle of Maiwand, our grenadiers firing in lines, those of you who've seen the film Zulu have seen how we shoot down our enemies, were attacked by massive Afghan forces. And in the annex to this document, there is a Captain Mannering who reports that during the battle, groups of Afghans wearing black turbans would choose a particular British soldier to seize. And even though many of them were shot down as they did so, they would grab one particular soldier, pull him out of the ranks and cut his throat in front of his comrades. And Captain Mannering says they were called Taliban. This is 19th century Afghanistan. And the Russians went there. I was there, 1980, 1979 they invaded. I saw them coming in, the great armies of Stalingrad arriving, and they were beaten after 10 years. What are we doing? We go to Afghanistan, we say mission accomplished, we set up Hamid Karzai, there's a democracy. Then we run off and invade Iraq and we say mission accomplished, and that goes up in flames. And now we're going back to Afghanistan again, because we're going to win all over again because the Taliban now have half the country. I call it in my paper tomorrow morning in my column, Iraqistan. That is it takes in Pakistan now. This is the war that we are now fighting. We're told Iran is the great threat. Is it so? I said in California 2 years ago, it is another country we should be worried about, a Muslim country which is packed with Taliban supporters and Al-Qaeda supporters and is totally corrupted. And it has a bomb, and it's called Pakistan. What is the real story of Iran? According to our newspapers, the mad mullahs want a bomb, and then the crackpot Ahmadinejad, he is a crackpot, by the way, is going to use it to destroy Israel. Well, I don't think Ahmadinejad knows one end of a nuclear missile from the other, and anyway, he doesn't control them. And if they were ever fired at Israel, they would destroy all the Palestinians, and then Iran would be destroyed. But the real story of Iranian nuclear power is a little bit more interesting. It was the Shah, our friend, our ally, the Shah of Iran, King of Kings, our policeman in the Gulf, who wanted nuclear facilities. And we Europeans, we lined up, stood on each other's shoulders to sell those facilities to the Iranians. The nuclear facility at Bushehr, supposedly such a great danger to us now, was built by the German company Siemens. And the Shah went to New York on his way to see President Carter at the White House and said in a television interview he'd rather like to have a nuclear bomb. And when asked, politely of course, why, he said, well, the Russians have one, the Americans have one, why shouldn't Iran? Nobody started shouting abuse or saying this is a threat. But when Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Iran after the Islamic Revolution, he said in a room about this size, and I was present listening to him and seeing him with my own eyes, he said, nuclear facilities are the work of the devil and we should close them down. And he did. It was only in 1984, at the height of the Iran-Iraq war, when Saddam, who of course was being supported by us, began to use gas, flooding the Iranian frontline trenches with gas, whose chemical precursors came from the United States and of course from Germany, that the military went back to Khomeini and said, look, Saddam is using weapons of mass destruction. Next time he'll have a nuclear weapon. We've got to reopen the nuclear facilities. And they did. And that was the story of nuclear facilities in Iran. I don't know if they want to make a bomb. I don't know if they plan to. I doubt it, but it's possible. But that first part of the story I've just told you, which many of you will not be familiar with, has been snapped off from the narrative. We have to begin with mad mullahs who want a bomb. And that is what you've been told. And thus, of course, we ignore Pakistan. And this is how it happens. And we journalists let this happen. We thread this narrative for you too. And we're all guilty of doing it. We're all responding to what the White House says, or Downing Street says, or the Quai d'Orsay in Paris. And we don't listen to the people who live in these countries, who would like to like us, but whom we do not intend to give freedom to. And that is the tragedy which we live today. Thank you for your patience, ladies and gentlemen.
LinkTV is the only U.S. network dedicated to global and national news, uncompromising documentaries, and diverse cultural programs. Programs which connect you to the world. To learn more, visit linktv.org.